So as I said, I'm going to try to tell you guys some history, how we got to where we are today. You can see my slide, right, Alex? This is working, the share is working.
Yeah, perfect.
So this is an aerial photograph of Jerusalem, and you see the old city, and the old city is a square of about 1 by 1 kilometer, and about 1 kilometer north of the old city is the area of Sheik Jarrah, which we're going to be talking about, which had a part in how this current round of violence was sparked or was set off. So in this photograph, the green line has been marked. And the green line is the 1949 armistice. So, you know what I'll do? A very quick going back in history. I'll do it very quickly, but I will. So the first thing I always tell people coming to this country is Israel and Palestine is the same place, right? This is just, I like this slide because I Googled map of Israel and I Googled map of Palestine, and I stuck them here together just to show you it is just two names for the same place. And there's been different plans for how to divide it. In the middle of this slide is the UN plan of 1947, which was a very complicated, strange way to make here an Arab and Jewish state in which Jerusalem would be international and Jaffa would be an island of Arab state inside the Jewish state. This did not happen, and we got instead the 1948 war. And in the 1948 war, the Israelis conquered most of what was British Palestine. The Jordanians conquered the West Bank, the Egyptians conquered Gaza, and we got that green line running through the middle of Jerusalem between Jordan in the east and Israel in the west. Also in the 1948 war, Mohammad mentioned that he is a second-generation Palestinian refugee, right? So there were about 1.3 million Palestinians alive in 1948, and about 60% of them became refugees in the 1948 war, fleeing the areas that the Israeli army conquered into Gaza, into East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and into other places. So most Palestinians are refugees. It's a minority of Palestinians that actually got to remain in their original villages, in their original neighborhoods, in their places of origin. So hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced. They were settled in refugee camps in the West Bank, in Gaza, and in other places. Many of them wanted to come back. The Israeli government said absolutely not. But the borders are absolutely closed. Anybody trying to come back will be shot. Many people were shot trying to come back. Border fences were built. And so what I didn't mention about the 1948 war, I'll mention it now, is there was forced displacement of population on both sides of that war. Right? So hundreds of thousands of Palestinians became refugees from what became Israel, and several thousand Jews became refugees from what became the Jordanian West Bank. Jews who fled areas like the Jewish quarter of the Old City and like parts of Sheikh Jarrah. So hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees came into the West Bank. Some of them, most of them, were initially in refugee camps. And the UN and the Jordanian governments were looking for ways to resettle them. And one of those ways emerged in Sheikh Jarrah. In Sheikh Jarrah, there was an area where Jews had lived and owned some land before 1948. which was now vacant, let's say. And the Jordanian government and the UN said, we will offer Palestinian refugee families homes. We will help them build homes in this area, given that they give up their refugee status, right? So the Palestinian refugees had a certain right from the United Nations to get access to United Nations education, healthcare, and other things, and housing in refugee camps. And they said, this is not a refugee camp here. You can build a house and you can have a garden, you can have a real house, but you have to give up your refugee status. And many Palestinians didn't want to do this in principle. They said, no, I'm waiting to return to the place that I'm from. I don't want to be resettled on. But 28 families in Sheikh Jarrah accepted this offer and built themselves homes in the 1950s and gave up their Palestinian refugee status. Those people, those 28 families who settled in this neighborhood in Sheikh Jarrah, some of them were from West Jerusalem, some from Haifa, some from Jaffa, from other places in this country. And they were all resettled in this area in Sheikh Jarrah. Then, in 1967, we had another war. Israel conquered the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and separated East Jerusalem from the rest of the West Bank. You can see in this picture, the pink area in the middle of the West Bank is an area, just about 1% of the West Bank, that includes the old city of Jerusalem and includes Sheikh Jarrah, that Israel officially annexed. This is a bigger map of the same area. And the Israeli government said, this area now is now Israel. Here's the old city in the center of it. Sheikh Jarrah is just north of it. And they started building big new Jewish neighborhoods around the Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem. Today we have some 200,000 Israelis living in East Jerusalem. But the old city and the area immediately around it, Sheikh Jarrah to the north of the old city Silwan to the south of the old city, remained predominantly Palestinian. And this became a major Israeli political problem because all the governments of the world basically still support a two-state solution. To say East Jerusalem should be Palestinian capital, and the center of East Jerusalem is still overwhelmingly Palestinian, so we can still make that Palestinian capital without displacing Jews. This idea that East Jerusalem can still become a Palestinian capital, very threatening to the Israeli government, to Israeli policymakers, and that's why they set about looking for ways to settle Jews into the central area of East Jerusalem, places like Sheikh Jarrah. And they tried to do this different ways, but the most significant way that they found is to find places like Sheikh Jarrah and in Silwan, also south of the old city, where Jews had lived and owned land before 1948. And they said, we're going to evict these neighborhoods. We're going to evict these families, these Palestinian families who live there, and bring Jews back to live in those places. The thing about this, right, so this is just the old city, and Sheikh Jarrah is here, and there's the same thing is happening basically in Silwan, also just south of the old city. The Israeli government is looking for ways to evict whole Palestinian neighborhoods, to make Jewish neighborhoods inside the central area of East Jerusalem. And the main rationale for this is to say, these are places that were owned by Jews previous to 1948. Now, there's some argument about whether this is true or not, and I'm not going to go into that too much, but there is no argument that vast swaths of West Jerusalem, of Haifa, of Jaffa, of the rest of the country were owned by Palestinians before 1948. So when Palestinians were forced out of one area, the Israeli government confiscated all their land and settled Jews on it. Jews were forced out of the other side. Now the Israeli government is seizing that land to bring Jews back here, but it's not doing the opposite thing on the other side. So what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah, and I know this has been a little, maybe I've got into too many details, but what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah now is refugees are being made refugees for the second time. Like, these are people who were resettled after 1948, and now they're being evicted because the Israeli government says, well, this was owned by Jews before. And they say, well, if that's the case, if ownership from before 1948 works, give us back our houses in Jaffa, in Haifa, in West Jerusalem. But the Israeli law is entirely one-sided. It takes Palestinian property, but not Jewish property. So this is just an aerial photograph of the small area that we're talking about. As I said, 1 kilometer north of the Old City in Jerusalem. And the houses marked in blue are the houses where Palestinian families have already been evicted and settlers have moved in. And the houses marked in red are houses that are right now in court with the Israeli government and settler organizations seeking to evict those families. And the plan of the settler organizations is, once they evict all the families, they're going to knock down those houses and build apartment blocks and make a big Jewish neighborhood inside the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. They started doing this already over 10 years ago. There was a big wave of protests around it. The guy, some of you may recognize the guy holding the megaphone here, is Jimmy Carter. In one of the Sheikh Jarrah protests a few years ago. Really, people from around the world have taken this into their attention because it's a very, very clear-cut case. It's people being made refugees for the second time in order to block the possibility of a two-state solution, which really means, where are Palestinians supposed to go? We squeezed them out of 78% of the country in 1948. Now we're squeezing them out of East Jerusalem. And it became such a big international deal 10 years ago that basically the Israeli government backed down and stopped evictions there for about 10 years. Now, very recently, they've gotten back to eviction suits and evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. This is Nabil El-Kurd. He's one of the organizers in the neighborhood. He's threatened with eviction right now. Another family threatened with eviction right now. This is just recently, they had a big iftar meal in the street to have people join them to protest what's going on. And Palestinians came and joined them, and the Israeli police responded with huge force. And just shut down any protest and used a lot of violence and arrested many people. And what happens when this comes to the center of attention, and a lot of attention has been pulled to it by the Israeli government, choosing evictions now and making it very high profile and pushing police in there, is really reminding, you see, the Israeli government has done a very good job of separating Palestinians. In East Jerusalem, they have one status. In the rest of the country, they have another status. In Gaza, they have another status. In the West Bank, they have another status. But the eviction of people in Sheikh Jarrah is one thing which pretty much all Palestinians can get together on, because it touches a very deep underlying fear that all Palestinians have, that they're about to be displaced, that the home that they have are temporary, because they have this memory, this trauma of 1948 and ongoing evictions since. And here are refugees being displaced for the second time, and this sparked protests all over the country. These are Palestinians in Jaffa, and the sign says, Jaffa, Gaza, Jerusalem, it's the same story, basically. This is in another town in Israel, in Lid, where there was a Palestinian protest and the Palestinian was shot and killed. This funeral. And so this was an opportunity that was seized by Hamas, which trying to position itself as Palestinian leaders, firing rockets at Jerusalem, saying, we'll fire rockets until Israel stops evictions in Sheikh Jarrah. To which Israel has responded with massive bombings of Gaza, destroying huge numbers of apartment buildings and homes, which most recent estimates have so far made homeless about 10,000 people just in this past week. I realize I've gone beyond my time. I'll just finish up by saying something that maybe we'll touch on more on the questions. It seems like whoever chose now to focus on these evictions in Sheik Jarrah and push this forward during Ramadan, it's the same time that they were pushing in Aqsa. It looks like somebody in the Israeli government was looking to push Palestinian buttons in the most effective way to get public rage going, to get violence going. We can maybe later talk about why, but that's a short version of, maybe too long, but my short version of what's happened so far.
Thank you very much, Yahav. As always, I feel you're very talented at cutting down a lot of information and making it as clear as possible. So I hope that that little historic summary was useful to everybody. And now I'd love to call on Mohammad. Maybe you want to say a few words about Sheik Jarrah before you tell us a bit more about the importance of Al-Aqsa. But let me just invite Mohammad to speak. And
well,
there you go. Thank you.
Thank you. Living in Sheik Jarrah for almost up till 75, in 58 up to 75. So I know all these families. We grown together. All those fathers nowadays, they were my age in the 50s, and now they are grandfathers the same as me. So we were friends since the first refuge, and we still. And I remember the days that through the war of 1967, I was hiding in a cave just under the main border between the two countries. And I still have the memories of how things used to be before. Walking to Jerusalem from that side, it was easy. And I can imagine nowadays the feelings of those families losing their homes again and losing their stories as being together all the time after 48, and suddenly they have the eviction order to leave. It's really, shaking for us as Palestinians, because that makes us be sure that the international looking at what is happening in this country without caring about the future of our generation. So I hope that things will come to peaceful solution, that people could stay in their homes as a way to show that the international enforcing power against Israeli government as a way to stop the eviction and to keep the people living in Sheik Jarrah and also in Silwan, which is the other step forward for the Israeli army or the Israeli government, is to evacuate also people in Silwan to make what they call it the King David biblical garden. So all that comes as a way to evacuate more Palestinians and to put more settlers in East Jerusalem, which in this particular time, when Israel built the wall, Israel have cut several of those Palestinian neighborhoods out of the wall. And inside the wall now, the majority is the Israeli Jews on the east side of Jerusalem. Imagine with the evictions, with more kinds of settlements built instead of the Palestinians' houses, that will make it that the Palestinians will be the minority in east side of Jerusalem, which that will completely close all the ways to have a peaceful solution in Jerusalem and in Palestine. I mean, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To talk more about why the Palestinians nowadays, they just rise up and start to have demonstrations and starts to have this kinds of such as Intifada. The other reason is Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is important for us as Muslims. You know that Jerusalem is connected completely with the Muslim faith. It is written in the Quran about it. And especially in Ramadan time, we have a special night, it's called Al-Qadr, which comes to be the day that, the night that our Prophet Muhammad came from Mecca and came to Jerusalem, and he prayed in Jerusalem in front of all the prophets that came ahead of him. And then he had been raised up to the sky and back to Mecca. So this is the importance of Jerusalem. Now, during years before the first Intifada and the second Intifada, Palestinians used to come to pray from all over, especially in Ramadan. It's important, the days of Ramadan, which is the Fridays. Could you imagine in this space that you are looking at, where the holy sites, which is the Al-Aqsa Mosque south, and the Dome of the Rock, which is with the golden dome, and the size of Jerusalem, the size of the holy mosque, which is the Haram, it's almost 142 donums, which is about 28, let's say, 42 acres, almost 30 times 12, 30. Yeah, 38 acres of land. Could you imagine that in some of those Fridays in Ramadan, over 400 people were stuck in that side praying for it? And even though in Laylatul Qadr, that over 350 to 400,000 were filled in that. Suddenly this year, Israel have completely closed all the access towards Al-Aqsa Mosque for the Palestinians in the West Bank, and gave the right only for some of the Palestinians to come to pray in the mosque, which mostly the highest numbers of Palestinians who attended prayer on Fridays in the Al-Aqsa Mosque was less than 100,000 this year. With all that comes that Israel even didn't respect the Ramadan days, that they gave the right to the Israeli settlers to get in the time that the Palestinians were, praying, and it's not the same time, but because the whole days of Ramadan was important for the Muslims, so they should be around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the Israeli army used a lot of, we call it punishments against the Palestinians' prayers, which caused a lot of casualties in the Palestinians, and that also gave the right to the Palestinians, Muslims of Israel, to come to defend the Palestinians in Jerusalem, and also that broke out that the Palestinians of Jerusalem, mainly the youth, have defended the mosque, and that caused more of the trouble in Jerusalem. And with the Sheik Jarrah story, that it was in the same time in Ramadan time that the Israelis have the right to evict because of the court order, that came all together as, if we go with these kinds of regulations in Jerusalem, it means that within a couple of years, several years, the Palestinians will have no chance to continue their living in Jerusalem as in peaceful ways and so on, because Israel will be completely evacuating people and taking more of the land. So it was such as a time that the Palestinians have to show their resistance and their way that we will never give up Jerusalem and we will never leave Jerusalem. So that all came together, where no one in the world starts to put more pressure over Israel to stop these things, even with all the demonstrations, with all that punishments, or the Israelis the Israelis attacks of the policemen and the border police against the Palestinians. Nothing happened. And when we discover also that during Ramadan, the last days of Ramadan, where at the last 10 days of Ramadan, people could come to stay in the mosque area, Israel doesn't want them to stay that time. They didn't want them to stay. They have to leave. And that also makes it much harder for the Palestinians to accept it. And also, there was a day that the Israeli settlers have to march to Jerusalem, which is a special day for the unity of Jerusalem as to be the capital of Israel. And that makes it much more anger in the Palestinian. And all these came together in Ramadan. And again, the government of Israel was still trying to put more force to prove that Jerusalem is part of Israel and we can do whatever we want. So no one could stop us. Even with all the roots, with all the demonstration of the Palestinians, it can't stop us. Suddenly, Hamas said that if Israel keeps on with these kinds of regulations, we will interfere and we will shoot rockets. And that's how it happened. So all the mass came out from Sheik Jarrah because of the eviction of the Palestinians and also because of the mosque in the old city of Jerusalem, which is important that the Palestinians have to defend it, because we have seen what happened in Hebron, the mosque in Hebron, where Israel took the power on it nowadays. They just divided the mosque, and that's what we are expecting, that some of those Israeli political parties are supporting those fanatic Jews to come to do what they call it, to rebuild the temple inside the Al-Haram. All that comes that the Palestinians got fed of this situation, and there is no chance to live in this kinds of regulations with the Israelis. And we are looking forward that it should change if the world will go on to enforce kinds of laws to stop these kinds of serious regulations that the Israelis are enforcing it in Jerusalem against the Palestinians. That's all what is going on. We can discuss that if you have more questions, so we can clear it more in each things that you want to ask for it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mohammad. I think you definitely speak to the kind of critical importance of Aqsa and this whole compound to the kind of Palestinian psyche. And I think that it's clear that any changes to the status quo is obviously a very provocative act. And I think you made that.
Just one thing to understand here,
sure.
That all these holy sites in Jerusalem still exist under the Jordanian Hashemite regime. They are the responsible of the security and the responsible of all these holy sites in Jerusalem. Now, in Jerusalem, we have the employees, which they are paid by the Jordanians. Some of these sheikhs, which is the muftis, and so they are appointed by the Palestinian Authority. And the security measures comes from the Israeli side. The three countries are sharing some of the regulations inside the mosque. In fact, things before the second Intifada was much less tense, because tourists used to come into, to buy a ticket, and they could, tour inside the mosque and all over the plaza of the holy sites. Since the second Intifada, when Mr. Sharon was trying to get into the mosque, and that was the provoking for the second Intifada, that was the main spark for the second Intifada. Since that time, the mosques have been closed for tourists and also for foreigners. Only Muslims have the right to get in. So since that time, the situation is getting much more worse and worse, day by day. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammad. So before we go to questions, I thought I would just try and summarize everything which we've heard so far into a kind of organized timeline, just so that you can see the kind of progression of events. Hopefully it won't take more than a minute or two. But I think it may be useful, because I know there's a lot of events, and probably even reading the news, it's hard to kind of keep everything clear in your minds, perhaps. So I'm aware that even by picking a start date is making a kind of political point here. But I think, as Yahav and Mohammad have pointed out, the two main causes of today's violence can be seen in the Sheik Jarrah evictions and in the changes or the clashes around Al-Aqsa. So it was in October last year when the Israeli courts first ruled that families must vacate. There was an appeal, and there was a kind of ongoing protests until now. Another very important trigger, which we haven't really covered, was that at the beginning of Ramadan this year, the IDF set up barricades outside the Damascus gate. They said this was to control the crowds, which often spend the night there, and this immediately caused protest, saying this was very unfair. And the following day, the Israeli army cut the electricity to Al-Aqsa to stop the call to prayer being broadcast. A few days after that, we had the beginning of what's become known as the TikTok attacks, where the first video that was uploaded to this social media platform showed a young Palestinian guy slapping two Orthodox Jews in a tram. And since then, we've had a spate of these kind of social media videos being uploaded, usually showing young men, some Arab, some Jewish, kind of doing these relatively minor attacks on people. This is definitely kind of fueling the flames. We had a very aggressive march of a right-wing Jewish group on the 22nd of April. And then the following day, we had the first exchange of fire between Israel and armed groups in Gaza. And I think it's important to say that although this was the beginning of this round, there are exchanges of fire between both sides fairly frequently. Over the past 15 years that Israel has been blockading Gaza, there have been several incidents like this. And of course, we should also mention that the huge power imbalance between the two sides means that one suffers infinitely more than the other. On the 25th of April, the decision was made to take down these barricades outside the Damascus gate, which seemed to kind of calm things down. For about a week, there weren't many notable incidents until the 2nd of May. There was another attack in the West Bank, which saw a Palestinian open fire, killing one Israeli Jewish student, wounding 2 others. They were students in a pretty right-wing settlement called Itamar. And then a few days later, we have another right-wing religious group setting up a table in Sheik Jarrah, right next to those tables which Yahav showed us of Palestinians celebrating iftar, the meal which you break the fast with at the end of every day in Ramadan. And there were clashes that night. The following day, there were more clashes, as Mohammad mentioned. This year, there were more restrictions than usual around prayer at Al-Aqsa, and many tens of thousands of people were prevented from praying. And then the following night was Laylat al-Qadr, which is a very important night in the course of Ramadan, particularly for Palestinians in Jerusalem. There were clashes that night, and in the following morning, things really kicked off. The Israeli forces stormed this compound on this Haram al-Sharif, which we showed you in the previous picture, injuring hundreds of Palestinians. And actually, the very same day, the Israeli Attorney General announced a postponement of about a month on this final decision around the evictions in Sheik Jarrah, which is also very interesting. And then the following day was the day that Mohammad mentioned, the Jerusalem Day, this right-wing protest, which sees quite provocative actions by national religious Jewish groups, often marching through Palestinian Muslim neighborhoods. It was rerouted at the last minute because of these sensitivities and such heightened tensions, and nevertheless it still went ahead. And that very same day, there was a riot in the town called Lod. Lod is an Israeli town, but it has a mixed Arab-Jewish population. And I think that this is something which a lot of times Israelis and Palestinians don't realize, that from the outside may seem quite unusual. In Israel, towns are almost exclusively either Arab or Jewish. About 20% of the population of Israel is Arab. But there are a few towns which are mixed, and Lod is one of them. And the violence there kind of starts a very worrying trend that we've seen in many other towns throughout Israel of this kind of intercommunal violence. The same day, Israel totally closed off the 2 crossing points into Gaza, sealing Gaza even more tightly than it already is. And that was the day that Hamas released this ultimatum. They said, if you do not fully withdraw from the Aqsa compound and call off the evictions from Sheik Jarrah, we're going to attack at 6 o'clock. And sure enough, a few minutes after that deadline, they fired their first large salvo of rockets in towards Israel. Israel, of course, responded with even greater force. And then the following day, things really started to kind of unravel in Lod and in many other towns since. A state of emergency was declared. And then the day after that, things start to spread into the West Bank. We have 2 Palestinians killed in different incidents there. And the Israeli attack on Gaza really kind of ramped up. We have huge amount of bombings and targeted assassinations. And really in the week since, this is when things have kind of unraveled entirely. And we now have nearly 200 deaths in Gaza, 17 in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, and 10 in Israel itself, which you can see quite illustrated quite clearly here in this graphic from Al Jazeera. Before we open up to questions, I just have maybe 1 or 2 more points to make, which I think are quite relevant. The first is that of the 2,500 rockets fired from Gaza to Israel, which is a huge number, and as we said, has killed 10 people, About 90% of the rockets which the Iron Dome wants to intercept, it is successful at exploding in the sky before they land. And this is an amazing piece of technology, but I think it is important to stress, how different the experience of Israelis under fire is compared to Gazans under fire. And on top of that, about 1 in 5 of the rockets fired from Gaza don't even clear the Gaza fence. So Gazans kind of suffer twice over. We don't have the same kind of data for how many rockets or how many bombs have been fired from Israel at Gaza, but this shows the destruction of the Hanadi building, one of the large towers in Gaza, which has been destroyed. Others have been destroyed since. And actually, since that Al Jazeera graphic was released, we actually have an updated toll, which has seen a few more people tragically die. And of course, maybe you aren't aware, but the protests have spread to surrounding countries. And we've even had large protests which resulted in deaths at the border of Israel and Lebanon. So things are in a very precarious position right now. We're very concerned about how things will progress. I think even just hosting a modest event like this, which shows that Palestinians and Israelis don't all wish each other dead, is an important kind of political step at this stage. So that's all I wanted to do by way of a quick summary of those events of the last week. And now I'd love to open things up to questions. We've had several great questions coming through in the chat, and I really do thank you all for those. And in the next 45 minutes, we're going to try and cover as many of these as possible. What I'm going to do is call on interesting questions that I found come through to me and see if people would like to read them aloud. So the first question that I'd love to hear, the first person I would love to hear from is Imad Abdin Ahmad. And if you are here, Imad, I'll just invite you to unmute yourself and you can ask your question aloud. If you prefer not to, then of course we can read it for you. But are you there, Imad Abdin?
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you. Can you guys, Yahav and Mohammad, you can hear okay? Great.
Yeah.
So go ahead, Imad. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, my question is to know who are the Jewish litigants who are seeking to remove the Sheik Jarrah residents? Are they themselves the previous residents of Sheik Jarrah? Are they descendants of the previous residents? Or are they just some people who happen to be Jewish and base their claims solely on their ethnicity?
You mean the settlers who came and settled and took over the Palestinians?
Yeah, the ones who are demanding that the Palestinians leave Sheik Jarrah, so that they could take over the land.
Okay.
So the land, there is actually more than one part of the land in Sheikh Jarrah. The short answer to your question is it's none of the same people. Right? And the main area that we're talking about is land that was owned, run by a Jewish community organization. And what's happened is a political organization has been set up and purchased the historic rights from that Jewish community organization. Based on that, they've gone to the courts to evict the Palestinian families. And they're not representing any of the people who lived there before, and certainly the people who they would like to settle there once Palestinians are removed are members of their ideological, religious, right-wing groups, and have nothing particularly to do with the families who lived there before 1948.
Thank you.
Okay, to go more beyond about these answers. You see, the court is still, since 1972, and you can tell it's over almost 50 years. Sometimes the court have ordered to stop it in the 70s and just to keep the Palestinians in it, and then they ask for another court, and usually every time they failed with it, they will continue with a new organization to have a new case in the court. Now, the documents that they showed it to the court, I don't know if it's a let's say true documents, because sometimes it might be a fake document where the Palestinians, with the help of the Jordanians and the Turk, They got the documents to prove that the land over there belongs to Palestinian people, but still, the court didn't take these measures and kept that the land belongs to the Jews. And according to the Israeli law, what if the land and whatever is on the land bill will go to the owners of the land. Now, the people who are living over there, which they are refugees nowadays, they also got documents and deeds for their land back home. So they told the court, if you say so, that because this is land belongs to the Jews, so we have documents to prove that we have land in in West Jerusalem and also in Haifa and Yahav, and we could show you the deeds of the land, and we are accepting your court to give us the right also to take back our land. And that doesn't work with the Israeli laws. So there is a double standard of laws in this country. Gives the right to the Jews to take whatever they have, if they have the documents, but not to the Palestinians, because all what the Palestinians lost their properties, it goes to what they call it, the government have the right to take over it. And there is no chance to get it back. So as myself, as a refugee, having documents and deeds of the land of my family in the village, which is called Kalonia, which is now Mevazeret Ziona, even it's just 5 minutes driving from my home to there, I have no rights to do anything in the land, even it's completely still exists the same as my grandfather have lived it in 1948. I cannot do anything in it, even with all the deeds. So this is the double standard laws in Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Next up, I'd love to ask Sharon, or possibly Sharon Alexander, had a couple of good questions. Would you like to ask your questions aloud, Sharon?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, one of them you just addressed. I also asked, I'm hearing, media from all sides, and some of the Jewish answers or Israeli answers about the barricades say that they were necessary because of violence. Is there any truth to that? And the other question was that, I had two questions. You mentioned the closure of the mosque to tourists, and I wondered who did that closure. And thirdly, it seems to me that the mainstream media is not covering very well Hamas's reasoning for why it's shooting rockets. And is there anything that can be done about that?
Mohammad, you wanna take this, or?
Go ahead first. Go ahead.
Okay. So the barricades at Damascus Gate were necessary because of violence, perhaps not in the way that statement was intended. That is to say, they were necessary in order for the police to instigate violence. What they did is they took this major place where people going to Aqsa and back go to, where people usually socialize and meet and sit on Ramadan evenings, and they shut it down, and they made these narrow, dense, tight passages in order to cause friction. And it was a pretty clear move in order to cause friction, in order to raise tensions. It caused so much tension that actually a few days later, they just dismantled it. And that actually relaxed the situation there. So it caused tensions, it was removed, tensions relaxed. And this goes again to what I was saying before, that the Israeli government was pushing for a confrontation. About the reasons of Hamas for firing rockets, You know, I think it's very hard to reason the reasons of also Israel and also Hamas in this beyond like what seems to me very cynical political calculations. On both sides, there's probably upcoming looming elections, and showing strength is considered to be politically useful. I don't think I could properly represent Hamas or say what was the point of shooting these missiles beyond what seems to me cynical political calculations.
Well, I might have an answer, but I don't think that will cover everything, because in fact, when Israel decided to close Gaza, it makes it just as a big prison. It's the biggest open prison in all over the world. In Gaza, security is very high. People over there could feel that they are free. They can spend all the night without any fear, because there is no military. Israeli military comes in. There is no settlers to attack, nothing. So they are living really in safety. But in Gaza, there is no possibility of life. There is no possibility of work. The poverty in Gaza is over 60 to 70%. And this is something that Israel have done it as a way that usually you have something that you are, you got the privilege of having security, but you don't have the money to have life, good life. Where in the West Bank, we have the Palestinian Authority, we have work. Palestinians could go to work in Israel, they have good income, but they also are completely in, such as also an open prisons. Each governorate in West Bank, it has completely surrounded by settlements and Israeli, checkpoints. But even we are talking about Area A, which is completely under Palestinian Authority security forces. Israeli security army could go over there, kill, shoot, arrest in Area A. So we don't have security. In the West Bank, with all the power of the Palestinian Authority, it doesn't give security for the people under its control. Where settlers are attacking farmers, burning the fields of the Palestinians farmers, cutting the trees, there is no one to defend the farmers or the workers in the Palestinian Authority area. So Hamas want to prove to the Palestinians who are living in the West Bank and Jerusalem, they have the power to back them against the aggression of the Israeli army and the settlers. That's the reason that the Palestinians could depend on Hamas in a way to protect them from the attacks of the army and the settlers. That was part of the reason that they might, when we have new elections, so that the people could vote to Hamas because they could feel that Hamas could defend them. And that's what is going on. And this is one part of the Israeli policy, to keep these two areas completely divided, not to have kinds of coming together, both sides, as a way to prove that we are in need to go for peace process. So they are keeping it a way of getting together in a unity. And this is happening since long time, that even the Israeli government, with the leadership of Netanyahu, is providing the power, the main power in Gaza, Hamas, with the Qatar's money budget every month as a way to keep them in force.
Thanks to you both. You kind of touched on something there, Mohammad, which a lot of people are asking. So maybe I'll kind of just collaborate a lot of different questions, and I can kind of give half to each of you. A lot of people are asking about how likely you both think the events are kind of a cynical ploy, perhaps on the Israeli side by the government, who aren't able to form a government. They've had 4 elections in 2 years. And maybe Yahav, if you could speak to maybe the kind of general political atmosphere in Israel around elections and around maybe the cynicism of Netanyahu's past acts, and is this maybe what he's doing again? And then Mohammad, a lot of people are also asking about the PA's maybe relevance today. You know, they cancelled the elections, and if maybe they're kind of complicit in this in some way, or if their rivalry with Hamas is kind of fueling this. So maybe Yahav, if you want to take that question first.
Right. So we have had the same prime minister for 12 years now, right, Mr. Netanyahu. He has a great gift for pitting people against each other and using sort of primal fears of the other anytime that he seems to be losing ground because of economic policy, because of other failures. He's always going to the great threats that he's protecting us from. And his position is weaker than ever in the last 12 years. Right now, he's 4 times, as you said, failed to make a coalition. And what happened, what was not in your timeline, but maybe should be there, is, and I don't remember the date in April, but sometime in April, the 30-day period that he was given to try to form a government ended, and that 30 days started of his main opposition. And they are a ragtag opposition. They need to get together many different people, including an Islamic party and Israeli right-wing parties. And it looked like they were going to be able to form this very strange coalition just because they all dislike Netanyahu so much. They would overlook many of their differences. And in many ways, it looks to me like this round of violence is sort of the culmination or a culmination of 12 years of Netanyahu's work of building these fears of people against their neighbors, of dividing Israeli society. So setting up the situation, it's very easy to just push a few buttons and get this sort of street violence breaking out. Before maybe Mohammad goes to the motivations on the side of Hamas, we have to say the fact that Hamas is in power is a Netanyahu policy. The military and economic and political force of Israel is such, it could have many times in the past 10 years conquered Gaza, dismantled Hamas rule, brought more moderate people to manage Gaza. But Hamas is very useful. It's very useful to the Israeli government because it's much easier for the Israeli government to deal with people who shoot rockets than with people who go to the International Court in The Hague. As long as the fight is rockets versus fighter planes, we win. Once it becomes legal and political, then Israel's footing is weaker. So Hamas has been maintained in power by Netanyahu, by Israel all these years, and they know very well how to trigger a reaction, a set of events like this. And you might even think that it's not just Netanyahu wants to stay in power, it's Hamas wants Netanyahu to stay in power because he's keeping them in power, because a new Israeli government with an Islamic party in it might weaken their position of Israel being an absolute evil that they're fighting against. And so it seems to me very much like this is something that was set up that has political uses, both, as Mohammad will maybe say now, for Hamas inside Palestinian society, but very much for Netanyahu to stay in power.
Okay. To talk about the Palestinians elections, which since 2006, we had the chance to have elections in this year, which was dated on the 22nd of May. Within a couple of days, we should start with it. But Unfortunately, things went bad because the Palestinians insisted that we have to have Jerusalem as part of the, the people in Jerusalem have their rights to have their own candidates, and they have their own campaigns in Jerusalem itself, which is completely rejected by the Israelis. And that completely affected badly the elections of the Palestinians, where the Palestinians who have the rights to vote in these elections, over 90% of them have registered. So they were just very happy to do the elections. And to me, I could look at the elections that it was such as a way that the Palestinians could elect a new leadership, which was maybe better to Hamas to have more chances to have much more victory in, because they are only one party, where Fatah had more than 3 parties. Others, the leftists, they didn't get into one coalition. All that divided the votes, and so it was completely misleaded, let's say. And insisting to have Jerusalem as part of the elections, things went completely, and they postponed it. But in fact, let's just go back that in the year 2014, before the war, the Egyptians have reached an agreement between Hamas and Fatah to have reconciliation, and they were agreed mostly to everything, and they have to sign on it. And that's when the war started in 2014, where Hamas dropped, they went out with their demands more than what they have accepted before the war, and that's also broke down that there was no kinds of reconciliation. And since that time, Qatar started to fund Hamas in Gaza through Israeli government, and since 2014 up to today, Gaza was having their budgets for their workers, for more of the infrastructure from Qatar. So now things is getting much worse. Palestinians, I think this is one of the main moments that the Palestinians in all over in Gaza, the Palestinians of 48 in Israel, Jerusalem, and the West Bank came all together. And tomorrow we have a big general strike in all over the country, in Israel, in the West Bank, and even in Jerusalem, as a way to prove that the Palestinians are united, and we are looking to have kind of international interfering, that it's enough to this situation. We need to have a kind of solutions. We cannot stay in this kinds of things that we could feel that we are such as in slavery days. Israel is using us in a way that they are having the main labor force in Israel, and we are not getting back anything. We could see the violence of the settlers nowadays, where they are armed. Yesterday, there was shooting in my neighborhood in Beit Hanina. 2 Palestinians have been injured. Several of those Palestinians who were working in Israel have been beaten badly. So it seems that things have to stop. There is no chance unless if the internationals have to interfere. We should have kind of international enforcing kinds of laws that the Israelis have to respect, and they have to go with it. Otherwise, things will get much more worse, and no one could stop it. I don't know if things get out of the hands of the Palestinians. There's the leadership that we don't start to trust it, the authority, and Hamas is doing whatever it comes to their minds as a way to prove that they are the main power. So the only way that the internationals have to come together to just put pressure over Israel to stop the war and to go back to the negotiations table and to have a limit time that things have to prove to the Palestinians that there's something is going to be much better life situation for them, their land, their future, and their country, and their freedom mainly. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I'd love to ask Cheryl or Hal. I guess you're together probably. They had a very interesting question. Are you there, Cheryl or Hal? How are you doing, folks?
Hi. We'll let you ask the question.
Okay, I have to go back up and find it now.
Oh, well, we heard, I don't know how credible it was, but we heard that it's a U.S. United States-based settler support organization that was doing a lot of the funding of the Israeli effort to evict in Sheik Jarrah. Have you heard that? And I mean, that's, have you heard that, and is it true?
Specifically in Sheikh Jarrah, is an Nahalat Shimon organization. It's based in Jerusalem. It's an Israeli NGO, but they raise a lot of funds from donors in the US, as in general do many organizations of the Israeli religious right. And without going too much into this specific organization, I can say generally about these various organizations that are involved in this larger project of displacing Palestinians and building settlements. Beyond their support from the Israeli government, they also raise donations. Those donations are coming mostly from the US and from two groups in the US. One is, right, I see Florian is writing this as I speak. Those two groups are religious right-wing Jews and religious right-wing Christians. So there is a strong and growing connection between the Israeli religious right and the American religious right. A lot of evangelical Christians in the US identify as Christian Zionist and believe that it's their religious duty to support the Judaization of this country and even support the project of the Israeli religious right to turn this country to a more biblical religious Jewish state. This was, it's something we've been seeing growing for years, this connection. It was maybe most dramatically expressed in the person of Mike Pompeo, who was American Secretary of State and was a very active evangelical Christian Zionist who went himself for the first time, the first American Secretary of State who went to visit Israeli settlements and say, we love this, I support this, this is what God and America wants. It's very different from the historic position of the State Department, which was to criticize settlements. So we see that shift, we see it growing, and there is both American Jewish, but also growing American Christian evangelical support for settlements and settler organizations.
Thanks, Yahav. I
Okay.
think that pretty much sums it up. So unless you have anything specific, Mohammad, I think that's pretty much a great answer. But thanks to Cheryl and Hal for your question and always your support. Next up, a very interesting question came in from a few people, and maybe I'll ask Margaret Cluett, if you're around and would like to ask it. I think it's quite an interesting one. Are you there, Margaret?
Yes, hello. I know that there are lots of reconciliation organizations working within Israel. And I wonder whether this current situation, well, just causes them despair, or whether it'll give them hope. It's probably quite a difficult question to answer.
Yeah, these are like, I can tell you a little bit because these are a lot of my Facebook friends. right? So I've been seeing. Certainly there is a lot of discouragement. There's been, we didn't talk about this, but there's been in Palestinian neighborhoods inside Israel, there's been also Palestinian protests, which the police has responded to with huge violence. And there's been looting and violence on the part of Palestinians. And there has been groups of Israeli far-right people going in to support the police or with the police in many cases. So we had groups of these militias with machine guns, with AR-15s. It's not so different from things we saw in America, walking together with the police through Palestinian neighborhoods, attacking Palestinians, and the police just looking the other way or supporting it. So it's been very discouraging. On the other hand, I have to say, there was a few days of this, and then there was counteraction. So it started, I think, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we start to see all over the country these organizations, reconciliation organizations, regrouping and organizing Jews and Palestinians together to go clean up streets, fix up houses where things have been set on fire, where looting has happened, where damage has been done. And you see a lot of spontaneous gatherings of people saying, we want to live together, we want to live in peace. So a lot has been broken. That will take a long time to fix. It has been very discouraging, but there's also been a lot of very nice things, some of which I participated in the last few days, where a lot of people who previously have not been involved in this sort of reconciliatory and joint actions have responded by getting involved and coming together. So there is discouragement, and there's also some hope.
Mohammad, would you like to add anything there?
Well, I hope, that the peace camp in Israel can have the power the same as it used to be in 1992, when they voted to Mr. Rabin. They were the majority in the Israeli population. But Yahav is saying, yes, it's true. There are some good Israelis who still, in need to have the way of life together, to have all these kinds of relations with the Palestinians. Me and Yahav, we could come together and we could live together, even though, because we have the same mentalities in a way that people have to respect each other. But the majority in Israel, I'm sorry to tell you, it's completely shifting to much more aggressive, extreme right wing, which we haven't seen it in the 70s and 80s as what is happening nowadays. The peace camp in Israel is shrinking and shrinking, and the power of the right wing is rising up and getting much more power from the government, and mainly from the settlers who are being, just imagine that this government just recently have legalized all these outposts. We are talking about 130 outposts in the West Bank, and the government have legalized them. It means that they are just backing up the settlers, whatever they are doing, and even ordering the ministries in Israel to have the money, the budgets for the infrastructure for these outposts. So when you are looking at this kinds of regulations that the government and the population in Israel, the majority, sorry to tell you, mostly as what I'm seeing as a Palestinian, are in other way, never looking or caring about the other side. It's terrible, really terrible. I tell you the truth, as a Palestinian, none of those workers, as what I'm hearing from my friends, are willing to go to work in Israel nowadays because they are in fear. They have seen several videos about what the Israelis have done to those Palestinians. I don't know if you have seen it back in your homes, but it's really terrible ones. And that's why tomorrow we have the what we call it, the strike for the Palestinians, as a way to show to the Israelis that we are fed of the situation. Also, we have to deal with each other as a human being. Stop this kinds of superiors and supremacy of the Jews and so on. We could live together. I'm out for one-state solution and equal rights for everyone in this country. And that's what we need. We need kinds of people to come together, to live, to say that we are equal in all our rights as a human being. And this is what we need. Stop all these acts of wars and so on. Come together as a way to live, to respect each other as a human being, not as a slaveries and, you know, victims of wars and so on. We don't need it.
Amen.
That's what we need.
Amen. I think we can all agree on that. Next, I'd like to ask if you'd like to read your question aloud, is Stephanie Jordan. If you're there, if not, of course, I can read it for you. But
yes, hello. Good night with everyone. Yeah, my question was directed to somehow the power that the Palestinian Authority has, in the sense that I don't understand why this so-called by Israeli judiciary problem is solved by Israeli courts under Israeli law, considering that it's in Palestinian territory, as far as I understand. So isn't there like a judiciary from the Palestinian Authority or some other source of accountability or institutions that can be held instead of raising the thing until the power demonstration of Hamas? Like, is there not like some middle ground, some other institution to protect or impart justice?
Okay. Now, Israel have divided the Palestinians in three categories. We have the first category, the Palestinians who were living in Israel since 1948, and those are giving the Israeli citizenship. Nowadays, they are almost 1,700,000. They are almost 20% of the population of Israel. So those people have the Israeli passports. So they attend the Israeli courts. The second category are the Palestinians of Jerusalem, which Israel have given them the Israeli ID card, but we are not citizens, but we have to go to the Israeli courts. So we cannot go to the Palestinian courts because we are almost out of any kinds of relations with the Palestinian Authority. Even as a Palestinians of Jerusalem ID card, if I go to the Palestinian Authority area and live over there, I will lose my benefits as the Jerusalemite ID card holder. They might just take it out. So we have to go with the Israeli rules and the Israeli courts and so on. And that's why the Palestinians of Sheik Jarrah are attending their courts in Israeli courts. The third category are the Palestinians who are living in Gaza and in the West Bank. Those are having different color ID card, and they are part of the Palestinian Authority control. Where in Palestinian Authority, they do have their own courts, and they have their own regulations and laws, and also is the same in Gaza. So this is the differences between the people of Jerusalem and the ones who are living in Israel, the Arabs. They have to attend the Israeli courts. And they have the Palestinians Authority have no influence over the Palestinians who are in Israel or in Jerusalem completely. So we have this kind of situation in the country.
Right. Another way to put that is to say, Stephanie, that the Palestinian Authority has absolutely no authority over anywhere where any Jews live. Right? So the Palestinian Authority rules over enclaves between Israeli settlements in the West Bank. But even if Israeli settlers were to go into, as they sometimes do, go into the areas of the Palestinian Authority and do whatever it is they do, destroy property or do damage, all the Palestinian Authority can do is try to escort them out of there for the Israeli army to deal with. The Palestinian Authority not only has no authority over any territory where any Jews live, it has no authority over any Jews. Its only authority is over those Palestinians who live within its enclaves. And so In East Jerusalem, where Sheik Jarrah is, the Palestinian Authority is absolutely prohibited by Israel from doing anything. Even when the Palestinian Authority donated money to fix schools in East Jerusalem, Israel came and arrested the workers and confiscated materials, because the Palestinian Authority is prohibited from doing anything in Jerusalem, even if it is fixing up classrooms.
And that's why we insist to have the elections in Jerusalem for the Palestinians, to show that East Jerusalem is still part of the occupied territories. And that's what Israel completely rejected and never will give us the chance to do. Okay?
They cleared it up, Stephanie. So my friends, we have about 5 minutes left, and we have so many great questions. I mean, I apologize, we're not going to get to all of them. What I will do is send the entire list of questions to our speakers, and we'll see if they have time to maybe answer some of them later on. I can't promise, but we'll do our best to answer them, if not now, later on. For the last couple of minutes, and maybe by way of kind of summary, a lot of people have asked a kind of general question about the international community, you know, what influence countries like Jordan, Egypt, the United States are having on this situation. And I think the most common question people have asked is, you know, what happens next? What's the future looking like? Do you have any predictions? And what can we do to kind of help things along and steer things in a more positive direction? So if you could kind of try and both answer those in your last couple of minutes as a sort of way to wrap things up, that would be wonderful. Why don't you go ahead, Mohammad? Yeah.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, as Palestinians, which we believe that the peace will help us to have our own free state, it didn't come out. Because the Europeans, Americans, they didn't recognize Palestine as a state. And this is one of the main things that just brought us to this situation. If it happened since the beginning of the peace camp, that the internationals have given the recognition of the Palestinian state, things will completely be changed. This is one main thing, that up till today, all what is happening, all these international community is part of it. And most of what's happening, the disasters of the Palestinians, should be taking on the shoulders of the international community. We are here urging the internationals to give recognition for the Palestinian state, as people should be free with their own determination to have their own country. You could help us in this way as a way to protect ourselves and our future for our children and grandchildren. The Arab world, I'm sorry to tell you that we were depending on the Arab world to help us, but the Arab world also is part of the American lobby. And what we are seeing, that the Arab world is, instead of supporting the Palestinians, they are doing kinds of new political relations with Israel that completely weakening us in our way of asking for having our own state. Because building kinds of these relations with the Arab world without fixing and solving the main problem with the Palestinians, it will never success, will never success. The main part of the conflict are the Palestinian people. You have to go and talk to the Palestinian people, not to the Emirates or to the Bahrainis. They won't help in this case. We are the responsible of our country, and you have to talk to us, and you have to make peace with us, not to make peace with the Arabs before you make the peace with the main essential part of the people of the country. So this is what is going on. I hope that the international will come to go on to have this kind of main points to do it in fast, quickly as possible, as a way to correct all the situation in this conflict. Thank you. Yahav.
No, I think that's a good answer.
Thank you.
Well, in that case, let me say a couple of words about other ways you can, support organizations which we are supporting, and of course our organization as well. As I mentioned at the beginning, any contributions you would like to make towards the cost of today's presentation, you can do so on our website, greenolivetours.com/contributions, as well as supporting the work of our collective and supporting a vision of the future which shows that Arabs and Jews can work together, as we hope to prove day by day as a collective in Green Olive. But we also, as I said, give money to the PCRF. You can also give money directly to them, I should say, an amazing charity which does a lot of great work supporting Palestinian children at risk, particularly in issues of health. There are many, many other great organizations out there. If you are interested in, working more, you can definitely contact us, and we can provide those sorts of things. And I think that it's really important to remember that although the news is always dominated by these really kind of dramatic headlines, and there are certainly very many dramatic headlines these days, there are so many great projects that are still going on. Green Olive is one of them, but there are just thousands of them, which are definitely struggling right now. I think our speakers touched on this today. The efforts of the last 20 years have not maybe proved to be as strong as we would have liked, but there are still some great projects out there which we need to continue to support, and we really hope that we can see a more just and peaceful future, and that you can all come back and visit us very, very soon. But we're still obviously very concerned about the next couple of weeks, months, and we hope not years, but who knows how long these things will last. Okay. So from behalf of myself and our whole collective, I really want to thank everybody who joined today. It's really just so kind of touching to see nearly 400 people who care about this stuff and want to support the work of Green Olive. It just shows you, I think, how important this issue is to so many people around the world. And if this wasn't quite enough for you, we are doing the same session in, what's it going to be? About 12 hours from now, we're doing another session. And we also, like I said, have 9 different online tours. If you want to learn more, for example, about Jerusalem with Yahav, we have an online Jerusalem tour. If you'd like to learn more about the plight of Palestinian refugees with Mohammad, he leads a Jordan Valley tour. And I myself lead a twice-weekly Gaza tour. All of those you can sign up for online on our website, and tell your friends to join us for future sessions. We'll definitely be keeping in touch with you by email, Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, wherever you want to find us. You can follow us on all those platforms. Okay. So that's all I'm going to say. If either of our speakers want to say any final words, you can do. But for me, thank you all very, very much for joining us. In peace, thank you very much, and good night.
I want to thank all those friends that they just joined us today. Thank you so much for coming to ask, to hear, to listen, to know what is going on. Especially, I have read several of those friends that I know them personally. They came. They've done tours with me, and some of them they stay with me at home. So thank you, and I love to see you again in the country. Maybe be having it better in situation, and also peace and love to all of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. I hope this has been helpful to you. If whatever questions people still have, also you can write them in. Also, there's another session tomorrow. Yeah, and we hope to see you again in better times.
Hopefully.
Inshallah.
Inshallah.
I didn't say thank you very much to both Yahav and Mohammad, so maybe that would be my final word. Thank you both for really great presentations.
Thank you.
We're really lucky to have you as part of our collective, so thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you for all.